Hello, welcome everybody. We're just going to give it a few moments while people trickle in. Everyone's having a lovely afternoon. So nice to see so many people here. We had record level attendance for this one, so I think we hit on a really popular topic or a meaningful topic, which is awesome. So yeah, I'll just give it another moment or two, and we can get started. Looks like the number is kind of leveling off. So welcome to Legal Issues in Collections Care, Abandoned Property. My name is Greg Stewart. I'm the Education Program Manager at the Conservation for Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCHA, and I use he and they pronouns. For visual accessibility's sake, I will say I am a white person with dark hair and glasses. I'm in front of a yellow wall with a bookcase and a map of Illinois. I'm wearing a blue shirt. And just a little bit about today's webinar. So just because you might not have a law degree doesn't mean you can't successfully navigate abandoned property law. Sarah Kapellusch, who's with us today, is a registrar at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, an instructor on legal topics for the Northern States Conservation Center. And she's going to really break it down for you in terms of what even is abandoned property, when is something abandoned, and how can you identify your own abandoned property, and then, of course, what to do once it's been identified as such. So before we get into the presentation, just some Zoom housekeeping. You are in Zoom webinar, so your video and audio are turned off, but you can always ask questions or make comments to us in the chat. The program is auto closed captioned in English, which you can turn on using subtitles, or you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. So we're going to have a presentation from our speaker today, followed by Q&A with you. But please feel free to ask questions anytime during the program. I will be reading those questions verbally at the end when we get to Q&A. So you might have noticed the program is being recorded. We'll send a recording as well as the PowerPoint in a follow-up email after the webinar is over. I just wanted to thank the National Endowment for Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation who make today's program possible. Sarah, if you could just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just one quick note about the organization I work for, the CCHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artworks on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field providing educational programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing, framing, and more. And you can learn more about what we do on our website, ccaha.org. So I'm very happy to introduce our speaker. Sarah Kapellusch is an instructor for the Northern State Conservation Center's museum classes online, where she teaches legal issues in collections management, collection management databases, and found in the collection, orphans, old loans, and abandoned property. She is also the registrar at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, where she is responsible for the administrative oversight of the historical collections. She is a past president of the Wisconsin Federation of Museums and has served on the AASLH Nomenclature Task Force, where she was an editor for Nomenclature 4.0 for museum cataloging. So with that, I'll say, Sarah, please take it away.
Thanks, Greg. All right, so welcome. Really excited to be here. This is the first presentation I've done with this group, and it seems like it does some really great things. For visual accessibility purposes, I am a Caucasian female. I have dark blonde hair, brown eyes. I am wearing a black shirt with a purple knit cardigan. I'm also working from home today. So behind me, there's a green wall. There's some children's artwork on the wall. And just in the corner, you may see here, note my guinea pig's cage. So she will be joining us. I am going to turn my video off for the presentation and I will come back for the Q&A just to avoid some of those weird eye placements you get in the webinars. So today we are going to talk a bit about abandoned property and abandoned property laws in a very general sense. And we're going to talk about how museums understand abandoned property and the different scenarios that are encompassed under sort of that umbrella of abandoned property. Because the way museums think about it and the way the law thinks about it doesn't always mesh up quite the way you would like it to. I'm going to talk a bit about a couple of the laws and the legal ideas that have the most effect on museums trying to handle abandoned property issues. And then I'm going to give some examples of what I've seen and what I've done and how I've handled some things in the field. Just those really most common scenarios that every museum professional is likely to face at some point. We will wrap up by talking briefly about the importance and usefulness of having a policy on how to manage abandoned property within your museum collection policy. And I'll show you a couple of tools that you might want to think about using that might help you think about abandoned property a little bit more strategically. There will be optional homework at the end, but I promise no test. So just a little bit about me. Like Greg said, I am the registrar at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I have been there since 2012. I've also been working as an instructor with the Museum Conservation Center for the Northern States since around 2013, 2014. I started off teaching databasing and then sort of inherited a couple of these other classes. I thought they were really important that someone taught them. They weren't being taught. So we picked them up, and honestly, they're probably the most popular classes that I cover. I've also worked for the Kenosha Public Museum System. I worked on the Harley-Davidson Museum Startup Project, and I did a stint at the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center. I've always wanted to work sort of in that registrar, archivist, collection manager capacity. I also have my master's degree in public history. I did a certificate in museum studies from UW-Milwaukee and the Milwaukee Public Museum. And I've got a BA in political science with the pre-law emphasis. Originally, I had planned to go to law school. I really wanted to be an attorney. I love contract law, which sounds really boring and nerdy, but I do. But I also love museums, so I found that registrar work is sort of a great fit because I get to do a whole lot of things I love, but I don't have a ton of liability. I also like to say, excuse me, I'm not an attorney. So please don't take anything I say today as legal advice. Think of it more as collection management advice. And as we get started, just a quick note that as we're going through this conversation, I'm going to be pretty vague and talk really generically about abandoned property law, and this is intentional. The laws are different for each and every state. I don't know all of them, so I just want you to think about abandoned property law and maybe get some of the tools you need to go and look it up yourself, because I cannot provide that information for everybody. Managing abandoned property, especially when it is multiple generations old in your museum, is probably the most challenging, the most intimidating thing museum professionals ever have to do. So if this makes you nervous in any way, you are not alone. I've done it a lot. I've taught it for years, and it still intimidates me. It still makes me nervous every time I have to try to clean up some element of abandoned property. There are a lot of problems with handling abandoned property, including the lack of a clear definition of what abandoned property even is, and we'll talk about that. And then when there are laws about abandoned property, they almost always pertain specifically to old loans where a lender is known. It's hard to talk about abandoned property in state law without a lender. So these laws don't generally help museums navigate all of the different types of issues that we come across. As far as I'm aware, there are not any federal laws that deal specifically with abandoned property in museums, which means that this always falls under state law and statutes where there's just little consistency. Not all states have laws, and in the states that do, there's a great deal of variation in how museums have to handle taking ownership of abandoned property. For example, the waiting period for taking ownership of abandoned property can vary depending on where you live, from anywhere from 6 months to 7 years. So it's a huge range. And those are just the states that have laws that allow that to happen. The inconsistencies of state law really make it challenging to both learn and understand what museums should do when faced with issues. And unfortunately, I think it can be a deterrent, which sort of takes those problems that we find and pushes them further out into the future, making it more difficult to navigate. And hopefully nobody in this webinar can say they've done it, but I mean, it's not unusual for somebody to take something, look at it, realize they have to deal with abandoned property law, and sort of accidentally forget about it again. We've all at least thought about doing that. So for my own curiosity, I do have a couple of polls, and I'd like to do the first poll now. Camilla can launch that for us. Does your state have laws that allow a museum or similar institution to take ownership of abandoned or unclaimed property? All right, great. So a good chunk of you know that your state has some abandoned or unclaimed property laws, or at least some way by which you can take ownership. Some of us aren't sure, and hopefully can help you guys go and take a look and figure out how to find out if you have any way by which to do that. All right, great. Thank you for that. The most basic legal definition of abandoned property, which I pulled from Cornell's website, not having to do at all with museums, just defining abandoned property. They define it as personal property left by an owner who intentionally relinquishes all rights to its control. So think of this sort of like the garbage you put out, or an old chair or a couch or something that you drop at the curb. The act of taking the garbage out, bringing a couch to the curb, demonstrates the owner's intent to give up control of those items and the rights to those items, and they are then free for somebody else to claim. In general, a person who finds abandoned property can claim it as their own, but they have to take steps to demonstrate this claim. That could be something as simple as taking that couch that you found in the street and moving it into your house. Or you might put a sign on it that now says property of so-and-so. You just have to do something that demonstrates that claim. So the trick is here, you got to demonstrate your intent. It can be really difficult, however, to determine if an item was abandoned or lost and whether or not the original owner actually intended to relinquish the rights to an item. So for example, we've probably all done this. You go for a walk, you find a quarter on the ground, you pick it up, you put it in your pocket. You've assumed ownership now via common law or the idea of finders keepers, right? Remember when you're kids, you talk about finders keepers, losers weepers. Well, this is exactly that. This is common law abandoned property. However, what you might not realize is you may not actually have the right to claim the quarter as your own. It depends on where you found it and what the intent of the original owner was. Especially if you find this on somebody's personal property and you pick it up, it's probably not your quarter. Now, not too many people are going to care about a quarter. Nobody's going to take you to court over a quarter. But depending on what the item is, where it's found, the courts or a jury may have to determine ownership by looking at all of those actions that demonstrate intent. When museums talk about abandoned property, we're usually talking about a couple different categories of items that we find in our collections. We're going to be talking about old and unclaimed loans. We're going to be talking about your found in collection items, your FICs, anonymous donations, drop-offs, mail-ins, and donations in collections where the paperwork might be incomplete, it might be incorrect, and you're just not quite sure what's going on. Abandoned property to a museum tends to be all of those items where we're not totally sure who owns it, where it comes from, what we can and can't do with it, and whether or not we need to keep it in the collection. These items might be really old. No one working at the museum anymore remembers even anything about them. They've just been there forever. Everyone's inherited them. One of the main reasons a museum might be looking into how to handle abandoned property, let's be honest, is either because you want to get rid of it and you want to remove it from the collections and you're not really sure if you can or you should, or they want to make sure that they're using the resources efficiently and not utilizing space or other resources for items the museum doesn't own or may not be able to keep. We definitely don't want to spend a lot of time and money that we may or may not have caring for something that we don't own, or that doesn't fit our collection scope or our collection policy, or that could just be taken away from us. So we've got some really good reasons to sort of review this abandoned property, right? The first category that I want to talk about that museums deal with under this abandoned property umbrella is our old loans. These might be permanent or indefinite loans where you know for sure that the items do not belong to the museum, but there hasn't been any current contact with the lender, or the items have just been at the museum for so many generations of staff that we're just not even sure what's going on. The owner could be a person who may or may not be alive anymore. The material may have been passed on to an heir or even the museum, and you just don't know it. The owner could be a company or another museum that either doesn't exist anymore or where the current staff have no idea that the loan exists. These long-term loans seem to be really common for museums in the early to mid 1900s when a lot of museums were opening. And in general, museums aren't really doing these anymore, which is great, but these can still be a chore to clean up. Another challenge with old loans is that we might be a little afraid to talk to the lender after so many years because these items might be a really significant part of the collection, and it would be both a lot of work and detrimental to your exhibits if you had to return them. I'll give you one sort of recent example from one place I worked. They opened a new museum and their collection, their exhibits were predominantly based off of items that were borrowed from a college, a local college, and they were on loan for 100 years. But if you read the loan paperwork, it said those items could be pulled, the loan could be recalled at any time. Well, if that were to happen, they would have almost nothing on exhibit. Everything significant that they were showing would have been pulled. Now, that hasn't happened yet, but just think about how many generations of staff are going to turn over in that 100-year period. And the lender actually, they closed their storage site. So those are exactly the type of loans that can be a problem 100 years, 120 years from now that somebody's going to have to figure out. You're going to forget about them. You're going to lose track of some of them. You're just not sure what's going on. So what may have been better would be to do maybe an annual or biannual renewal, even if it's a little scary, because what happens if the paperwork doesn't get signed? So my recommendation for these old loans is really just to clean them up and try to reestablish contact with the lender. Then you can return items you don't want and get new current loan paperwork for the items that you do want to keep. Loan paperwork should be renewed annually so that we stay in touch with the lender. If this isn't possible, you'll have to follow your state's abandoned property laws or apply common law principles in order to take ownership of those old loan items. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. I can give you just one other example where we had to clean up some old loans. Now, the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, we work really closely with our State Historical Society. We share a storage facility, so we're pretty interconnected, but we're not the same institution. We had a lot of items on exhibit, some more like civilian type items. We don't collect a lot of civilian stuff. So we had those on exhibit because you need them to almost serve as props, right? But what we found is there was loan paperwork, but it was really old and it looked like the intent was to transfer, but we couldn't. So ultimately what we did is we sat down, we inventoried the material. We got new paperwork signed where we renewed the loan paperwork every single year. And now we also know that as those items come off exhibit, we're supposed to return them. So it's all documented and we know now exactly what we are trying to do with them. Another category is the unclaimed loan. In some ways, these are those loans that we sort of forget about. They might have some documentation and attempts to contact the donor, probably many, many years ago, may have occurred. Plans to return the loan may have been in place and just fallen through, and no one from either side really cared or was in a hurry. And after time, no one really remembers anything about them. These are generally items that you know had a connection to a person, and there may be some documentation. You might have a date, but no names. You might have initials and a phone number or just an address, or it may be something that came in on a temporary custody receipt for potential donation or for exhibit. It may have been something accessioned and not connected properly to the intake paperwork. It's going to be something odd like that. I actually found out a few years ago that I was a culprit and my museum had an old outgoing loan that was totally forgotten about. It was from 30 years ago and there wasn't any paperwork on it. Again, this happened before me, and someone realized that the items were missing, but rather than tracking them down, what they chose to do is to deaccession them without ever figuring out what even happened to them or where they went. And then a couple years back, I got a call from the borrowing institution and they had found it during an inventory. Like, don't know what you're talking about. I don't have any record of this loan. But luckily we had an old catalog card that noted the existence of the item. It was a uniform jacket and it had a note on it that had been deaccessioned. So what you kind of see here is that these unclaimed loans can be incoming, they can be outgoing. They're a bit of a puzzle to solve, but ultimately, if you want to call it from the collection, you may have to follow abandoned property law or just common law is last resort. These are probably the most common things we deal with are found in collection items. These are those odds and ends that we find during an inventory project. They may or may not be associated with intake paperwork. They were likely not processed into the collection or they were processed incorrectly. They may be items previously listed as missing. They might be numbered incorrectly, stored somewhere they shouldn't be, or they may have been brought in by a staff member and quickly put on exhibit without proper numbering and cataloging or without telling your collection manager. These are those mysteries that we all end up needing to solve. Most of these types of items are not going to fall under your most common abandoned property laws unless you can determine for sure who owned them and where they came from, because you really need to be able to make contact. So for these types of things, what I do is I process and catalog my found in collection items into the permanent collection. For us, this is basically how the museum demonstrates that it owns the item. So we're kind of back to that idea of intent. Our intent is to manage it, care for it, keep it. We will attempt to reconcile these items against missing items, old deaccession pieces, prop and study collection items. And if that fails, we generally will note everything we did, where it came from, where we found it, and maintain it for the collection. If you can't determine where something comes from, just document everything you do. You may want to consider holding the item in the collection or treating it as abandoned property if it must be removed from the collection at some point. In general, at my museum, we do not remove found in collection items from the collection unless we have matched it up to a signed certificate of donation. To me, these just are a little bit too risky. Anonymous donations, drop-offs, mail-ins, these are my absolute favorite type of abandoned property because I think they're pretty easy to clean up. For all of these types of items, there is clear intent of the owner to relinquish control over an item to the museum. The owner has also purposely made it impossible for the museum to track them down in order to return the item or to get assigned donation paperwork. So the act of mailing in an item to the museum or dropping it outside the museum door demonstrate the intent to transfer control of an item to the museum. Another example may be an owner who refuses to take or accept a return. So maybe something goes to collection committee and you decide you don't want it, you ship it back to them and they reject the return. So not accepting the return demonstrates the intent to give up control over the item. If the museum wants the item, they should process it into the collection, noting in the record how they were received. And if the museum doesn't want the item, I think it's generally okay to pass on it and transfer or dispose of it as long as you keep a record of the item and the transaction in case there were ever any questions, in case a donor or an heir calls, hey, did you get this? Did you find it? What'd you do with it? They'd have to prove that it was theirs and that they dropped it off, but there's still that intent there. So basically, you should just note it, note what it is, how you got it, what you did with it, why, and then the dates. In these instances, it would fall on the owner to prove that they own the item and did not intend to relinquish control over it, despite all of the actions they took to abandon it. So I have another poll. I'm going to ask Camilla to launch for us. Have you ever received anonymous donations in the way of overnight drop-offs left outside your institution? I was mostly curious about this one. We get these from time to time, and it just kills me because we're on State Street across from our state's capital. It is so public out there that if somebody leaves it, it's almost the equivalent of leaving it out as trash because anybody could take it. Yes. All right. Many of you are in the club. Great. Thank you. For those of you who haven't, you don't know what you're missing out on. Finally, we may have to deal with collections where the paperwork is incomplete. Some examples of this may include donation paperwork that's not signed, or it doesn't list all of the items individually that were included as part of the donation. It's not uncommon for museums to take something as a lot or the collection of Bob Smith. So when you don't list out all of the items individually, it could potentially be a little bit of a problem. It might be harder to match up later. Might also contain missing important contact information. You might not be able to read the handwriting on the paperwork. That's happened to me. Or the restrictions are no longer reasonable and cannot reasonably be satisfied for whatever reason. In these instances, document everything the best you can, and I will say that over and over again. Try to clean up the paperwork and get a signature on it if needed. These are the items that I really only worry about if I want to deaccession it and dispose of it. Unless there was a safety issue with the piece, I would generally just keep these types of items in the collection with a note about the paperwork and where the discrepancies are. If you want to remove it from the collection, you really should try to get in touch with the original owner to clean up the paperwork. The donation is very old or you're unable to verify that the donor is deceased, you may not need to worry about it as much. And I can give one sort of example about this. Our museum took in a Norden bomb site, I think in 2006. And one of the restrictions on it is that it was taken in by the museum, but it had to live at one of our homes. We manage a couple of different veteran care facilities. So it had to live at one of these homes. Well, eventually the home decided to do a remodel and they did not want this item anymore. The space it was in was also too hot and we were experiencing some melting of a couple of the rubber components. So the museum decided that even with the restrictions on it, the best thing we could do is to pull it and bring it back to the museum proper and keep it in our storage facility where it would not disintegrate any further. But what we did, because of the restriction on it, is I did attempt to contact the original donor. And what I found was that they were deceased. And I was able to look at obituary records and track down most of the family members. None of them were even local anymore. There was nobody to really contact about this piece. So we made some notes about why we moved it and we basically closed the file on it. We wouldn't take it out of the collection, but that's one instance where I think it was okay to not follow the restriction anymore. Do know that in rare instances, if you remove something like this from your collection, it could be problematic, especially if it's newer. Try to contact the donor and clean up the paperwork. If you can't, just make sure that you document everything you do and why. And depending on what it is and what you want to do with it, you may want to consider following your state's abandoned property laws. It might just make sure that you want the museum to be doing its due diligence and make sure that the museum is protected from suit. So certain items may warrant that. If you want to learn more about the legal side of abandoned property, the legal primer on managing museum collections is great. It's a great tool. I like it a lot. Though, like a lot of legal language, it is a bit tricky to read and even harder to understand. And honestly, it seems to get harder to read every edition that comes out. One thing, though, that is important and you may want to read about more closely is this idea of statute of limitations. While there may not be any specific laws that pertain to this in museums, it is useful to keep in mind from a common law perspective, and it's really important when dealing with your abandoned property. This basically pertains to how long someone has to bring a claim. So usually a lender would demand the return of an item from the museum and the museum will not comply. They will say, nope, we're not giving it to you. In some states, a museum can use this to remove a lender's claim over the item. We might also think of this as a waiting period for abandoned property or how long a museum should hold something in its care before it can be removed from the museum and the collections. Now, this only pertains to items that the museum does not clearly own. Someone can't donate something, sign all of the paperwork, and then change their mind a couple of years later and expect to get the item back. That does not fall under statute of limitations. In order to start statute of limitations under this waiting period, the museum has to take some action to trigger that statute of limitations period. So how does a museum trigger the statute of limitations? It depends on the laws in your state, but in general, you have to notify the lender of your intent to take ownership of the item by a certain date. And unless they take that described action, then the museum is going to take ownership. So for example, my donation paperwork states that any item that the museum does not accept for the collection will become museum property if it's not picked up within 2 weeks or if other arrangements are not made by a stated time period. Our legal department actually added this language for us so that we could claim ownership of these items and then do what we needed to do with them in order to remove them from the museum. Now, in reality, we always wait more than 2 weeks, but this is that trigger. One other example, we take things in on a temporary custody receipt. And everything that comes into the museum starts there because we've got a collection committee that will review things for donation. And the language, if you read it for that TR, sets a trigger date of 365 days after the date of intake. So we really treat our temporary custody receipts as a 1-year loan. And while we usually won't do it per the paperwork, we can then claim that after this period, any items left in our possession belong to the museum and we can do what we want with them. This is where we might choose to process something into the collection to demonstrate our ownership of the piece. And remember, it's all about intent. You also have to remember that this may or may not hold up in court. In general, we should send a notice that includes date, the name of lender, description, the original loan period, who to contact, and exactly what will happen and by when. And if we can't get in touch with the lender, you should post it in the newspaper. Everything I've read, all of the laws I've seen still say newspaper. It's not the best anymore, and a lot of these smaller municipalities may not even have a newspaper, but everything I've read is still pretty clear that they want us to post if we're looking for an old lender in a newspaper. If after giving notice, the lender does not comply or can't be located, the museum may choose to process the material into the collection and treat it as museum property. This is how the museum can demonstrate its intent to take ownership. Document everything you did, who was involved, dates, and save copies of everything you sent or posted in the file. And make sure you note the date that the museum decides to take ownership. If there's still the potential for legal action, it's a good idea to keep that item in your collection until the expiration of the statute of limitations. So at my museum, we would have to hold it for 7 years. When they are subject to our current paperwork, it clearly states the 2-week or 1-year period. So we may or may not hold that new material for as long as the 7-year period, but anything older that came in with different paperwork, we would hold for 7 years before we could really remove it from the collection. It would also depend on what the risk profile of an item kind of looks like, how much trouble we would get in if we got rid of it and a claim was brought against the museum. And you know your collection. Some things are going to get you in more trouble and some things are going to get you in less trouble. So just be thoughtful and either keep it for the whole period or like us, we've got different paperwork and different language. So just use your best judgment. The exception for all of this, in my opinion, are items that are clearly a safety hazard or that are in such poor condition that they would really not have any value of any kind to a reasonable person or another museum. For those types of things, I would document them, demonstrate my attempts to contact the lender, the original owner, and then describe why the item needed to be removed from the collection. And as long as you have a solid argument and your director or other administrators agree, I think it's totally fine. We had something come up with some radioactive material, and I would never worry about getting rid of those things because my staff's safety is way more important. And while rare, no matter what you do, there's always the chance that legal action could be taken against your museum. And remember that in most cases, the burden of proof, especially when a museum has taken all of the needed steps to contact a lender or owner, will generally fall on the person making the claim, not the museum. They will need to prove that they own the item and not the museum when the museum has held it and maintained it for a long period of time. If this happens to you and a claim is made against your museum, try to separate yourself from the material. In these instances, it's not up to the museum to decide ownership, it's really up to the courts. Just give an honest account of what happened and let the courts decide, and then comply with their decision, documenting everything in the museum records. The items do not belong to you personally, they're museum property, so try not to take a claim personally. I find that a lot of collections people, myself included, tend to feel a very strong connection to the collections that they manage every day. And in some instances, this connection may be too personal and it might not be helpful. Also, keep in mind that abandoned property issues are not the only reason a museum may have a claim made against it. There could be heirs or family members or other people who believe they have some right to an item in your collection. The museum can't give accession to property away to individuals in these instances. The museum should not attempt to determine ownership. Always work with the courts to get a resolution. I can give one really quick example of something that happened to us. We have a Medal of Honor in our collection from a Native American Korean War soldier. His daughter gave us the medal, and some family members in the tribe came to us and said, "We want it back." Well, even if we wanted to give it back to those family members, we wouldn't be able to do that because we received it from his daughter and she's still alive and she wanted it at the museum. So in those instances, if they wanted it returned because it doesn't fall under NAGPRA or any of those laws, the courts would have to come to us and make a decision and say, yes, we've determined that this medal needs to go to these other family members in the tribe and you can't keep it. Because as far as our paperwork is concerned, we own it, and the only person that could make a claim against it is really that original donor. You do not want to get in trouble for giving something away to somebody that it shouldn't go to. We're not attorneys, just do your best, make a good faith effort and document everything. See, I said it again. If your state has applicable laws, do your best to become familiar with them and try to follow them. If you don't have laws to guide you, apply principles of common law and just use good sense. Say it a lot, document everything. Also remember that sometimes the best result, the best solution is just to keep something in the collection. If the risk to the museum is too high, don't take it. Use your best judgment as the person who knows the collection the best. You know which pieces could cause a problem and which ones are likely to not be an issue. Last time, I promise, I think, document everything. If you have access to an attorney, it's okay to ask for help. It's totally okay if you do not fully understand your state's property law. You're a museum professional, you don't have a law degree, you have not gone to a very expensive law school for 3 years to get a law degree. So it's okay, just do your best. In general, you are only required to follow the abandoned property law for the state in which the museum is located. This comes up in the class I teach a lot, where people think that any place that the lender lived, you have to do the postings and you have to go national, and it's just not the case. You just need to try to follow the abandoned property laws for the place you work in, the place that the museum is located, and then the place where the lender lived. So their last known residence, you should do your postings and things there too. But you're still only subject to your state's abandoned property laws. And if you do not have a policy in place regarding abandoned property, it might be a good idea to work with your museum staff and administrators to create one. So I just wanted to kind of show this quickly. So we do have a policy in place, predominantly about old and abandoned loans, because at my museum, we have these loans that date back way before we had good records and were professionally managed. So we have a policy in place right in our collection policy that explains how we are supposed to handle this. Our state also has more specific abandoned property laws, and there's a link to that in our collection policy as well. However, I find it's not as helpful as it sounds, because that language, it's just basically several pages of text that tell us what needs to be included in our notification letter. That's really all it is. So I just wanted to show this. This is pulled directly from my collection policy. So everybody knows that they have to follow this, and we're really consistent with how we would handle this type of claim. Another tool that might be helpful and something we create in the class I teach on founding collections is this flowchart cheat sheet. Basically, you have this visual representation of your state's laws and your museum's policies regarding these types of items. And when you find an issue, you follow the chart to its conclusion. This way, you know that if you are following the chart, you're taking the correct steps. You should research your state's laws and review your internal policy to make one of these that's relevant to your museum. And the idea is that you can kind of post it at your desk or keep it as a handy reference tool. So if you remember at the beginning of the presentation, I said there would be optional homework. So this is it. I would encourage all of you to research your state's laws and review your internal policies and procedures, and then come up with your own abandoned property flow chart. It might even be fun. Great intern project. This is something else I like. This is not mine. If this is yours from a presentation I attended a couple years ago, let me know. I love it. Um, so this is something that is part of a larger deaccessioning form, but I think it's really great and that it helps us to think about our collections a little bit differently, especially when handling abandoned property, because it allows us to rank our thoughts in regards to risk. So looking at all these metrics might help decide how far we need to go to try to contact a lender or an owner, as well as help us decide what the best options are for final disposition of a piece. Something that is low value, that's mass produced, in good condition, in bad condition, with unclear documentation might be determined as okay to transfer or dispose, while something of high value, good condition, with an unsigned deed of gift might warrant more investigation, and the museum might determine that it's too risky to remove something like that from the collection. You can create a risk assessment form based on the parameters that are important to your institution. This is really just like the way we're already thinking about these things in the background, but in a visual representation that's easier to assess via the metrics versus emotion. And it might be useful in some instances, such as if you want to take your thoughts and ideas and your decisions to your administrators or a collection committee, this can help you show them why you made the decisions you did. And I wanted to just share some resources with you. These are the ones from the presentation and also the ones that I use regularly when working through these types of museum mysteries. I've also included a list of the sites I like to use to try to track down lenders and their family members. In general, when dealing with old loans or abandoned property of any kind, old or new, I like to start with some basic people searches, and I also try to determine if the lender is alive or not, is that can help direct my decisions a lot. In a lot of instances where I've run into trouble, it's not uncommon for the lender or donor to have passed away. And in these instances, I might not remove something from the collection, but I will probably process it and take care of it and do all of those things to demonstrate the museum's intent to take ownership. Because without some information or documentation from the courts, I wouldn't be able to hand it over to someone else anyway. Because, like we said earlier, it's just not my place. It's not the place of the museum to actually determine ownership over these items. All right, so I wanted to make sure we had some time for questions, and I'm going to turn my video back on. I know this is sort of a text-heavy conversation. I hope nobody fell asleep.
Well, I certainly didn't, Sarah. I thought that was fascinating and lots of great tips. And I really appreciate, like, I know you said you weren't going to get into the legal stuff too much, or in terms of you're not a lawyer, but like, this seems very informative. And we already have a ton of great questions coming in through the chat. So I'm going to try to get to as many as I can in the next 13 minutes or so. But just know if we don't get your question answered here, I see, Sarah, you've generously put up your contact information. So appreciate sharing that. I think one of the first, it was sort of a side chat, but I'm sort of interested in hearing your thoughts on this, Sarah, or really for other people in the chat. Maybe they have experience with this too. And I know you mentioned one example where there was something that didn't actually apply to NAGPRA ruling, and that's the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, for those of you who are not familiar. Someone was asking someone else in the chat, I would love to know if you've dealt with any NAGPRA material that is abandoned property. And I'm wondering if Sarah, you might have some insight on that, when those laws might, supersede each other or come into conflict or something like that.
So I have not actually worked with NAGPRA. I teach a little bit about it, and I have not yet prepared content that deals with the changes of law that happened earlier this year. Every place I've worked, they like finished their NAGPRA project before I got there. So I heard a lot about it, but didn't have to work with it. But in doing the research I've done, so like our thought is that we generally do not have things that fall under NAGPRA in our collection, but I believe the change in law sort of makes those determinations up to the tribes. Now they get to determine what falls under those categories, but it still has to sort of meet the needs. So for us, the Medal of Honor that I mentioned, that belonged to Mitchell Red Cloud, and it is a American medal that he got while he was in the United States military. It's pretty far from NAGPRA. And one of the things is even with NAGPRA, like the tribe can come in and make the request, and depending on what it is and where we got it, a lot of the times we're thinking about like grave items that were looted, that were stolen, that were taken. This was very clearly donated to us with appropriate paperwork. So in that instance, I don't have the right to give it back to anybody but the owner. And because that owner signed the paperwork, it's really state property. So I would not be able to make the decision to give it to somebody else. I'd have to have a court order to give it to somebody else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you for that, Sarah. That's a great kind of example to think about. And we've definitely been talking a lot internally here at the CCHA about resources that we can do with all of the changes to NAGPRA. So um, stay tuned for that. I don't have anything on the horizon yet, but we definitely want to make sure that we are providing resources to as much, or at least pointing people to the resources, I should say. So hopefully we can do that soon too. We have another question. The next question that I found in the chat. Hello, if we wanted to accession an anonymous donation, should we still fulfill our state's abandoned property law to accession, including the 3-year waiting period?
I probably wouldn't. I would process it, but I would know in the background that there is a small chance that somebody could come forward and try to prove that that piece was theirs. With the anonymous donations, they kind of lose the right in a lot of regards to claim it because they've given it to you. Now, unless I guess there's two examples of this. So a truly anonymous donation, you have no idea where it came from versus like a listed anonymous donation where the donor wants to be anonymous, but you still know where it came from. So in that instance, you would want the signed paperwork to accession it if it was just a donor who wanted to be anonymous. But if it's a truly anonymous donation, I would absolutely process that because they would have to first demonstrate that they did not intend to transfer title to you. Why else would they give it to the museum? Right? I mean, that's why you give something to a museum. So I would take it, I would process it, and I would just put a note in the record that it was abandoned. And I probably would not remove it from the collection for the 3 years unless you had a really good reason to do so, especially if it was something that could be viewed as being more valuable, either monetarily or from a historical standpoint. But you want to demonstrate your intent. Your intent is to take ownership of it. So yeah, I would accession it. I accession those.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And just this is, I see a comment in the chat, which is a great follow-up to our previous question, which is the National Park System has a great training series on the new NAGPRA rule. And so that was definitely where we first
Oh,
learned,
great.
when we were having this question ourselves here at the center. So that, maybe we can try to find a link for that somewhere, but national parks have some great information there.
Yeah, I would like to check that out too.
Yeah. Okay, next question. What if you have problematic items like ivory or things like bird wings? How would you deal with items left behind that maybe you also don't want or can't add to your collection formally?
Well, I guess it depends on the why. So I totally understand all of those issues with ivory or taxidermied animals and things like that. But when you're dealing with abandoned property, it really is more about where it came from and how you got it. Now, there are some things that are looted from other countries where international law and local law basically says that it needs to be returned to the country of origin. There's certain war trophy things like that that we can't take. I believe ivory is more of an ethical issue, though I could be incorrect on that. I think it's more of an ethical issue rather than it has to be returned to a certain location. So those items, I'd be sensitive with them, but as long as you have paperwork, you know where they came from, I think it's okay to transfer those or remove them from your collection. And again, I don't know what your internal policies are either. So different people have different collection policies and different places have different level of ethics and morality that they're applying to their collection policies. But in general, if you own it, you've got signed paperwork and you can legally have it, you can do what you want with it.
Next question. I'm really just trying to go in order here, so hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. Any comments? Oh, and I also see that Camilla has put a link in the chat for that NPS site. And I also see just a question about, we have a couple questions about this. Will the presentation be shared afterwards? Yes, we will send out the PowerPoint in a follow-up email. So just making sure we're getting to those questions. One question is, any comments on the average cost of posting a notification in the newspaper or court's cost if ownership is contested?
So hopefully if ownership is contested, the museum's cost would be pretty minimal because it would be up to the person making the claim generally to pay those costs. Now, if you bring in legal representation, you'd be responsible for that. But a lot of museums I found either have somebody on the board they can use. If they're a bigger institution, they might have legal representation. There's some options. You don't necessarily need to bring in a lawyer because what's the museum really trying to prove? They just really should be giving an honest representation of what happened in their paperwork. So I would expect those costs to be pretty minimal. And that's assuming you can't work something out with the owner. And I will tell you, just to back it up a little bit, for whatever reason, where I work right now, I get people that request donations to be returned to them several times a year. We're really clear in the paperwork what is happening, that they are transferring title, but I get donors that change their mind, and I get family members after a donor passed away that want the items returned to them for whatever reason. We don't return these things, but through conversation, you can explain to somebody why the museum is the best place to have these items and to care for them. And you can share things with these people. You can send them pictures, invite them to come and see the collection. And most of the time that would take care of those issues. I think going to court is pretty low down the list of things that really and truly happen. As far as posting in a newspaper, it's not super expensive. I think a lot of newspapers charge like so much per letter that you would post. But if you're a nonprofit, you can probably make a couple of phone calls and see if they will help work something out for you. I'm also in the back of my mind hoping that that changes at some point because I just think about newspapers, and one of the requirements would be for me, for example, if they were trying to find me to claim something, they'd have to post it in my local newspaper where I live. Waukesha County, where I live, doesn't really have a local newspaper that anybody has access to. So I'm kind of hoping that this slowly changes, or at some point posting it on your museum's website with a certified letter might be enough, and hopefully we'll get there. But no, I don't think the cost would be super prohibitive, and I bet you can ask for help as a nonprofit and get some help.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And that's a relief about um, the legal cost and lack of likely court dates for this stuff. So next question. In Kentucky, our abandoned property law states that an item has to have intrinsic historic, artistic, scientific, or cultural value to be governed by these statutes. There is no additional definition or regulation about how to define intrinsic value. Yeah, woof. My reading of this is that if our team of curators and museum professionals determine that the item lacks intrinsic value, we are not governed by abandoned property law and may keep or dispose of an item as we deem otherwise appropriate. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that could get you in trouble.
Uh-oh, okay.
I like the idea of it, but if that is not a terrible loophole, I don't know what is. So my thoughts on that, if it is something that is already in your collection, it's been accepted into your collection, which tells me if a museum wants it, it's got some value. So I think that would be a bit of a hard argument to make. Now, if it is abandoned property, some kind of donation, anonymous donation that shows up, something that is obviously garbage, then you may be able to make those determinations and get away with it. But I would not touch that for something that is already in the museum. It's almost like there's a book about this, like the power of museums and how the second something is in a museum, it all of a sudden like takes on these characteristics of intrinsic value just by the nature of like being numbered and cataloged. And I would keep that in mind. As soon as it's in a museum, you're kind of telling people that it has some importance. It's just the nature of what we do.
Great. I think maybe we can take one more question, and there's so many great questions. I wish we had time for all of them. but I think a lot of people are just writing in to say how appreciative they are of you, Sarah, and of this webinar. But just maybe one more question, especially since this is sort of somewhat related to our discussion of NAGPRA, but maybe different. And maybe if specifically not about NAGPRA, are there any resources you can share related to human remains in collections? And this person is specifically looking for material related to ashes, maybe within this idea of
That
anonymity.
I'm not familiar with. And I have read some things, and I don't recall ever reading anything about ashes specifically. That might be a really good question to take to if you've got like an ethnographic or other type of museum, one of those big ones. Like for me, if I had that question, I would take it to the curators at the Milwaukee Public Museum, who I know deal with a lot of that type of material. I'm just not sure. I haven't seen it.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Sarah. And I think we will, we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So lots of great questions, but again, you can always email Sarah directly. Or if you want to go through CCHA, we can forward those. But I just want to wrap up and say just a big thanks to our speaker, Sarah, and to my colleague, Camilla Dawson, who's been behind the scenes with all the tech and setup for today's webinar. Big thanks again to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, the Independence Foundation, and to all of you for showing up today. Our next webinar is actually going to be the first in a multi-part webinar series on a succession planning initiative for cultural institutions that we've been doing. We're going to present on some findings of a big study we did with support from IMLS and a consultant called Lyrasis, and that will be on June 28th at noon, so we hope to see you there. So when this window closes, you're going to have a little survey that pops up. So we would love your feedback on that survey to just help us know how we're doing and make our programs even better. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Camilla. Hope you all have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
Awesome. Bye, everyone.